Hey everyone, today I'm really excited to welcome you all again to this very special Geo interview of a renowned global cybersecurity expert who's a professor at Department of War Studies at King's College London, Dr. Tim Stevens. Sir, hope you are doing great.
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. So before we dive deeper into this interview, I want to ask a very basic question since there's something very fundamental that I want my viewers to understand. So you are involved in the strategic discourses of cybersecurity for a long time now through your academic endeavors and research. So based on your experience and your wisdom, what exactly is cybersecurity for an individual as well as a state? And why should we as a society should talk about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also a very big question. I mean, fundamentally, cybersecurity is about defending and protecting digital networks and systems. It has its origins in very, very technical communities that were really involved around data protection, ensuring confidentiality of data, and the ability to access data that has not been corrupted in some way. But over the recent years, cybersecurity has come to mean something a little bit bigger than that, which is also how we use computer networks, or how we protect the computer networks upon which modern everyday life runs, and
Right.
also the critical infrastructures that allow us access to food, water, transport, logistics, government, military and intelligence, and so on. So it still has that defensive, protective aspect, but it's much larger than just computer networks and systems. And of course, built into that, there's also an offensive side to it as well, which means how can we exploit computer networks and systems to achieve wider political goals? So it's become quite a broad field of policy and practice.
Mhm. So what I heard from what you said that there are some risks associated with cybersecurity. And constantly, because of this, governments are really working hard to bring some compliance in it. Like they have to create some
Mm.
safeguards, they have to create some laws, they have to make some policies to somewhat balance between an individual's privacy and state security. But when it comes to again cybersecurity, the scope becomes global. Like if I'm talking to you right now, you are in London, I'm in India right now. So we are talking through a medium which is far apart from each of us, and yet somehow we are making it work. But again, how the international community is governing this, and what are the cybersecurity concerns that are associated with this?
Yeah, that's again, it's a great question. And historically, cybersecurity or information security was quite local, but as you said, it's expanded, through the international internet, the global internet, to something that affects all of us. And of course, as you say, we're speaking today on a relatively secure line between continents,
Yeah.
and a job of cybersecurity is to enable us to do so, but also to protect our communications in various ways. And of course, so something that was relatively local has become national policy and international policy, and the international community has recognized this. And the balance, there's a couple of different balances. One is between, as you say, the privacy of your data, my data, our ability to communicate, our ability to work, and so on. But there's also a tension in the international sense between what national strategies and policies are, which different countries might pursue because they have different aims and ambitions, and the aims and ambitions of the international community to keep this whole thing running, and to try and develop laws and norms and ethical frameworks that sometimes countries don't agree on. So this is why it's political. It's because it's contested. There are divergent opinions and views on what this thing should look like. After all, cybersecurity is a form of security, and all security is contested and has competitive aspects to it. So there's lots of different tensions there, which means that the global governance of cybersecurity is a very complex and difficult process.
So, is there a consensus possible between the nations when it comes to cybersecurity? And what will that look like? What does that consensus look like?
I think there's a general consensus that at the technical level, we need the global internet and other digital systems to be able to what we call interoperable. So they can work together using common standards and protocols. And indeed, that's what we're doing now. We're using open source standards and protocols that everybody uses to allow everybody in principle to communicate with everybody else. The problem when the problems really enter. I mean, there are some issues around standards, but the real problems come in when it's about what we use these networks for. And every country has slightly different opinions on kind of how we should use these, what communication should be used for, how people are allowed to express themselves on those networks, and so on and so forth. And in that space, you get slightly different national conceptions of what we want global cyberspace to look like. So they have different visions, different ambitions, and that's really at the highest level of international politics. You do get a lot of divergence between countries that have very different views on how this amazing technology should be used.
Right. So since you talked about the open source aspect of it, uh, what do you think about the Open RAN network that the United States is trying to achieve in the Indo-Pacific, and what exactly it is? If you can shed some light on it.
On the what, sorry?
The Open RAN network that the United States wants to create in the Indo-Pacific, that all the telecom operators who agree to certain standard compliances that all the nations should follow. So, what's the politics behind it?
Yeah, that's not something I know very much about. That's outside my area of expertise. But in principle, what has happened over recent years, I mentioned that standards layer,
Right,
and there are at the moment the internet works on a set of very basic protocols, right? TCP/IP and being the classic one, but there's loads of others too.
right,
And that allows a relatively global open internet. There
right,
are countries that wish to have their own standards or to change the standards to allow or disallow certain types of activities, or, of course, to be able to control those standards better. At the moment, the internet started in the in the United States, and a lot of those standards, of course, are written in English. They are Anglophone technical communities, and understandably, there are parts of the world that would like a rather larger and louder voice
yes,
in those conversations. And I do understand that. And I think we could do a lot more work in that space. But there are other countries that are trying to use things like standards as geopolitical issues and to try and resist American hegemony in this space, for example, and so on. And they become battlegrounds for geopolitics, which is not what you'd expect of technical standards, right?
right,
And I imagine what's going on in the Indo-Pacific is part of that, because the US, for its part, has always said we need an open, interoperable, relatively free internet that people decide to use how they want to use it. That's the high-level narrative. That's complicated. And there are other countries that say, no, we want to be able to control what happens inside our borders, and imposing, if you like, models of national sovereignty onto a very global, international, technical phenomenon.
So, coming back to the cybersecurity aspect, I was reading your book, Cybersecurity and Politics of Time, and I found that it's a very fresh perspective on how security concern can be interpreted. So, can you elaborate a bit about, for our viewers, why the temporal framing is important for understanding the cybersecurity?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is when we think about international relations and security, we tend to think of it as an issue of territory over which states have sovereignty, right? So we're very used to dealing with the spatial aspects of things like security. So my proposition was that we don't really talk a lot about time. Space and time go together. We know this, but often we just assume that time is a linear thing that goes from A to B. There's a history, there's a present, there's a future, and there's just a straight line between that. Now, my proposition, and there's a lot of other work in the field that now looks at this, is that time isn't just a straight line. It's something that we interfere in. It's something that we change. And there are certain temporal framings that are really interesting when you look at cybersecurity. And I'll give you an example. One is about the way we perceive the future. And just a moment ago, we were discussing this issue. It's how do particular states see the future of the internet, the future of national security in a global information space. And the ways that we see the future can have really interesting effects on what we actually do in the present, how we bring about these futures, which tells you something fundamental, which is that this isn't a straight line from the past, present, future. We can actually change those futures The way we think those futures acts back on what we want. Now, that's actually a fairly central political concept. It's just it's not really discussed much. And I'll give you another example of in cybersecurity. If there is a straight line between the past, through the present, and into the future, there is an argument in what we would call positivist or quantitative modes of analysis in the methods that we use to look at cybersecurity that says if we have enough data from the past, we can predict the future. Now, you can predict a future, but is it going to be the right one? And the answer, undoubtedly, in a really complex, fast-moving, dynamic environment like cybersecurity and cyberspace, is you probably can't predict the future with any confidence because things are happening all the time. The variables are changing, the conditions are changing, and so on. So we have to think up other ways of thinking about how we can look at the future, sort of not predict, but have some kind of intimations about what these potential futures are going to look like. And sometimes looking at the past is absolutely the wrong thing to do because it can skew and bias the way that you think about them. So those are a couple of just little examples. But that project itself has got a lot more to say, I think, about the way we think about time, because time isn't static or passive; it's actually active. And we do we do things actively in the international system and in national context that change the way that past, presents, and futures interact.
So, there's a saying that the history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes,
It
right?
rhymes, yeah.
So that's what is going on, I guess. Like the data that we use today, the data that we consider valuable right now might not be that case in the future. And
Yeah.
again, you are right when you say that we need to think about it in that terms as well. Like what matters right now may or may not matter tomorrow, right? So again, when we talk about cybersecurity, the line gets blurry between privacy and national security. You know, since everything can be weaponized and be used to cause maybe a divisiveness in the society itself. So, what is your perspective on this? And do you think that the society as a whole, the global society, has become more politicized because of this virtualization of how we communicate and through what we communicate?
Yeah, and this goes back to the security aspect of cybersecurity. When we think about classic national security, uh, it's about securing the state at the borders, but very often it turns inside too to look at what's happening inside the state. And issues of political expression or resistance are framed as national security issues because they threaten the state in some way. Now, if you have a set of technologies where, like you and I have access to digital technologies, and in India, hundreds of millions of people do too, and it's not under the direct control, if you will, of the state. It becomes very problematic for states who are unwilling, perhaps, to expect or to allow certain types of activity in there. So they want to know what the data is and what it's saying and who's saying it and what the connections are. And we saw this really, particularly with counterterrorism, say 20 years ago. We're beginning to see it a bit, a lot more now with cybersecurity, particularly in places like China, for example. And these issues of privacy are brought right up in conversation and in tension with national security, because this data that we are communicating and creating flies across national borders. It connects people in all sorts of different ways and in different contexts. It allows for political expression. In some ways, it's incredibly or potentially very subversive of particular national frameworks around what is and what is not allowed. And some countries actually frame a lot of these privacy or personal issues, as it were, as issues of national security, just if only because they have the potential to be a challenge to the state, even though most people aren't a challenge to the state whatsoever. They're just going about their daily business, right? They're talking to friends and family and doing work and so on. But yeah, this privacy issue comes in direct conflict sometimes with formations of national security.
So I feel that the function of private actors as a lingua franca between the individuals that we use the services, like I use my mobile, there's some private entity that provides me the services. They have to follow certain compliances, some legal compliances before they can produce something like this and give it for a wider use in the population as a whole. So, but how far do you think that these private actors as well can be governed when it comes to cybersecurity? Like,
Yeah.
are data fiduciary compliance is enough to hold private actors accountable to avoid something like, let's just say, Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah, it's the where private actors, companies, firms, and so on sit in this landscape is a really interesting one, and there's a lot more work to do to understand, particularly how states and markets interact and how private and public actors interact. Essentially, the internet, even though it began in US government and their academic partners, is essentially now a commercial entity. And in some parts of the world, that's a real challenge to the authority of the state. In most of the world, in fact, arguably all of it, the internet and digital systems and networks and corporate systems and what have you are all built, supplied, maintained, and used by private actors. The usual statistic is, at least in Europe and in North America and in East Asia, indeed, and many other places besides, roughly 90% of the internet is owned or operated by the private sector. So, this, just thinking about it in those terms gives you a flavor or a hint of why states might think that that is in itself a challenge to authority. Now, the question you asked is like, how do you regulate and govern in that space? Well, it's really, really difficult because a lot of the innovation that's happening in technical terms or technological terms comes from the private sector. So in a sense, states are always a step behind as a new product or a service comes to market and people love it. Think about social media. When I was a student, there was no such thing. But these days, it'd be hard to imagine life without it. And trying to regulate those spaces is an incredibly difficult challenge. And I don't think we should underestimate that. What I would say is that there's lots of different types of private actors. There's the ones who supply the infrastructure. There's the ones that do social media. There's small companies, large companies, selling all sorts of different products and services into the global market. And they all have different ambitions. They all have profits to make. But most of them are two things. The ones that are big enough to care about security do actually care about security. They want security of their enterprises and they want to improve security across the piece because it's good for business. The ones who don't have a lot of money and resources find it very difficult to be secure. But generally speaking, there is an awareness that they need to work with government, with regulators, and with transnational policy and standards and so on to try and improve cybersecurity, but it's a huge, huge challenge. And we've come a long way, but I think we're going to see a lot more in that space over the next kind of 10 to 20 years.
I must imagine how much of politicization of these issues do occur in multilateral organizations like International Telecommunication Union. So can you
Yeah.
shed some light on that if you know about it?
Yeah, and I think that's a good example of some of the themes that we've been discussing is that once upon a time, the security of computer networks and systems was something that was done in a back room in an organization or perhaps in a remote part of government. And it was just a technical team that was dealing with, fairly low volumes of data, some old systems and so on. But now it's nothing like that. It's a global issue, and the infrastructure that we need to secure is absolutely everywhere, including the phone that you and I carry around with us all the time. So it has become politicized in the sense that we're still trying to work out what to do with all this stuff. And multilateral organizations, as we sort of hinted at a couple of times, have this role to play in developing international public policy that regulates what we can and cannot do in this space. International organizations are also forums where diplomacy around those issues takes place. They're also places where we argue about the applicability of international law to certain things like offensive cybersecurity around cyber warfare and so on, and so on and so on and so on. And then you have, different types of multilateral organizations like the European Union or ASEAN or the regional political groupings, and they're all having these conversations too. And then you get these other very strange ones like the Commonwealth. India is a member of the Commonwealth, as is the UK, and they have their conversations too. And in each of those, they have different emphases, and objectives. The Commonwealth, for example, is very concerned about cybercrime, whereas the United Nations Security Council is much more concerned about espionage and the potential for warfare, and so on. But you can find lots, and the EU, European Union, is really concerned about cybercrime, but also about regulating social media, for
Hmm.
example, or the use of AI. So they all have these different emphases. And it's come from this very low politics, if you like, right up to this very high politics of international diplomacy, foreign policy, and really, really arguing, sometimes quite bitterly, at places like the UN about precisely, what the internet should look like, who does it serve, and so on.
So, since you talked about EU, I'll tell you
Mm.
something about what is happening in India. So, in India, there's a genre of legal services that dedicatedly provide you how to make your websites and your digital infrastructure GDPR compliant. So, that
Yeah,
explains how much of a wide this issue is, right? And we talked a lot about, you also talked about AI right now. So, what roles do organizations like UN can facilitate for maybe norm setting in the cybersecurity of critical
yeah.
infrastructure? And maybe concerns regarding frontier technologies like AI that we saw at the Bletchley Summit recently.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and uh, the UN, for example, uh, over the last 25 years now, has been trying to resolve this issue of the norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, as you know. It has come a long way from those preliminary discussions. It's not perfect, but there are 11 consensus norms on what states can and cannot do, and indeed what they should do in cyberspace around protecting digital systems and infrastructures, and also not subverting them or ruining it for everybody else. And it's, people often criticize it and say, yeah, but we don't have a global treaty or we don't have international law for this specific issue. Well, no, you don't. You do have international law does apply. We have developed norms that say you can't, for example, attack critical infrastructure in another country. You have a responsibility to assist another country if it needs it, and so on and so forth. So we've taken a long time to get there. It's not perfect. We know that. Around AI, we're currently embarking on quite a similar process, but I suspect it's going to have to be much more compressed in time to try and do something about it because the pace of change is so much faster. I mean, literally, the uptake of AI and machine learning tools is a lot faster than we even saw with the internet over the last 30 years. And as you say, those discussions happening nationally pretty much everywhere, but also happening in regional organizations and also at the highest level of multilateral fora like the UN, the G7, G20, and so on. And they're all coming up with slightly different frameworks. We all know there's an issue here that we need to somehow, if not solve, at least address in a beneficial manner that means we can reap the benefits of it while attempting to regulate or prohibit the worst aspects of it. But it's so fast moving that it's a massive challenge. And whilst some good stuff has come out of all different parts of the world, it's going to be really interesting to see where we are, not just in 5 years' time, but even in 2 years' time, because it's a
Got it.
really challenging area to work in.
Right. So, again, since we are talking about AI, there is a lot of debate about ethics, human rights, and privacy that intersect with how we use AI and how the AI is getting developed. So, is there anything called an ethical way of performing the machine learning process that goes behind AI? Like, there are some certain ethical compliances that are included within the design of the AI model itself to ensure that nothing unethical happens when the end user uses it. So, can we
Yeah,
achieve such a consensus within that?
we we can. It's as ever in these issues. It's whether there's the political will to do so, and it's not just about the politics of states either. It's about the private sector, and I think all the things we've learned about the private sector and cybersecurity. What's happening now in AI has blown that out of the water. It's much more complicated, and the companies that are in this space are much more powerful perhaps than anything we've seen before. And there's an awful lot of demand for it too, of course, consumer demand. demand from other economic sectors, demands from governments to be able to use these tools in ways that will make their life easier, more efficient, more productive. Uh, you know, across multiple economic and social sectors. The problem is with it is that it is, this is where states and markets have to really cooperate to think about how we can balance ethical uses of technologies like AI with the less attractive aspects of it. My personal suspicion, and let's not forget, before I tell you my personal suspicion, let's not forget that the technologies we're talking about here are completely incomprehensible to most people, including the people that develop and deploy them. They don't understand what's happening often inside the black box of large language models, neural networks, and so on. And my personal feeling about this is that it's going to get an awful lot worse before it gets better, because the way that AI is developing is far too fast for effective regulation, and partly because we don't really understand even what we want. And it's really difficult to enter into negotiations about something as complex as AI and machine learning if we don't really know precisely what we want at the end of it. Do we want to turn over public sector efficiency to AI? Do we want AI to be telling us what we can and cannot read? Or, what I've seen a lot of AI used for is not particularly socially productive. There's a lot of nonsense out there. There's a lot of cheating and plagiarism and what have you, and fake news and disinformation and misinformation and all the rest of it that you and your sort of audience will know perfectly well. And I don't see that being reduced anytime soon. I think we have a very difficult few years ahead of us when we're trying to work out what truth is, what we want from these technologies, which are undeniably powerful and have all sorts of socially beneficial and productive uses, absolutely no question. But at the moment, that's being drowned out by some of the rather more unpleasant aspects and detrimental aspects of it. And it's going to be really, really tough. I think, as I said, I think we've got a few difficult years ahead.
Right. So again, coming back to the cyber aspect of it,
Mm.
let's talk about the cyber offensive warfare doctrines, and what are the offensive cyber capabilities that can be achieved. Like there are some states where national security concerns supersedes privacy, and in some states, I argue it may be other way around. Like it depends on how the state is interpreting what privacy means. So, is there anything called absolute privacy?
Ah, technically, no, probably not. We haven't invented information systems that are 100% secure. The other thing is that data privacy doesn't exist in its own bubble. It interacts with normal people's everyday lives, the way that we use things, and sometimes we're not very secure, and so on and so forth. I think it's incredibly difficult. We don't have absolute privacy in any of our other parts of life as well, but perhaps we have rather more choice in how we exercise or how we draw the boundaries around our private selves. I'm sitting in my house here. I just lock the door. I decide to spend my life with my family, and that's fine. I can just lock the door, put the phone down. I have privacy. But as soon as I pick the phone up, the smartphone, or get on PC, everything changes, and it opens up these channels and avenues that can be exploited by people who wish to do so. And I might not have my security settings set up properly, or I might do something daft like click on the wrong link and allow a piece of malware onto my device, and so on and so forth. It's really, really difficult to draw that boundary around the private self in the digital space. And I think it's a huge challenge. And of course, it can be exploited, very often is. So how we develop the tools and the ways of working and the understanding that allows people to exercise privacy is a really challenging one. The one thing I have to say is that for anyone who's looked at Facebook's security settings around privacy will know that it's an incredibly complex and difficult process that you will never get right.
I'll just say, let me use the service. I don't really care what these compliances issues are about.
Well, that's the other thing, right? We all assume, there is the assumption that everybody cares about this, and they don't.
Yes.
yeah, you
And
know, a
that's
lot
how
of
they get you.
users, yeah, I mean, a lot of users just they don't care. It's like they're telling everybody about their lives all the time, and you know, on social media or whatever. And if something, it's not a major concern. And I think that you're right. It's an entirely different sort of challenge. If you're trying to convince everyone that actually privacy, data privacy, and so on are a norm that you want people to abide by and develop and maintain and disseminate and promote. That's a massive challenge in itself because not everyone thinks like that.
Yes, exactly. Like this private companies say that when government comes in the play, they try to regulate everything, which comes the
Mm,
way how we innovate. So they demand for less regulations, and when they regulate it less, there's so much of pressure from the civil societies that privacy compliance is an
mm,
issue. Like India recently passed a
yeah.
law that privacy is a fundamental right. But what exactly is privacy? You cannot define that, right?
Yeah, I find it incredibly difficult to define, and I don't really work in on privacy specifically. What I would say, I know that it's a very flexible concept, and the boundaries of privacy are permeable. They can be they're quite flexible. They can be amended. They can be broken. Just to go back to your point about regulation, there is this assumption that firms are companies are averse to regulation. That they you know as soon as the government gets involved in something, you know they're going to regulate, uh, and that's a bad thing. What's happened in cybersecurity, of course, is that at least say round about 2010, so let's take 2010. At that point, governments in the West and in many other places they were not keen on regulating for cybersecurity. So they thought we'll let the market sort it out. We'll let the market provide solutions. Enterprise will do its own thing. It'll settle down. And we'll have a much more cyber secure environment. It didn't work. And governments like my own in the UK and in the US have, and you know, particularly the EU, but many other places besides, have said, look, we do need to regulate in this space, and they have been regulating. So, you know, the GDPR is a very good example. It's not a cybersecurity regulation, but it talks about data privacy and data protection, right? So, you know, the very wide-ranging set of regulations that has affected the entire world in various
Hmm.
ways. But in cybersecurity, about not just incentivizing firms to do better cybersecurity, but requiring them to do better cybersecurity. And what's interesting about that process is that the private sector sometimes really wants to be regulated, but it just doesn't like to say it. And
Okay.
it's worked very, very closely with governments
Why they want to be regulated? I don't understand.
because it's realized that better regulation of cybersecurity can actually help everybody. It's good. It's good for productivity. It's good for business. It's also increasingly something that you can sell to your clients and to your consumers and your customers. Because if you say, look, we have a type mark, a standard or a classification saying we are cyber secure because we have abided by these regulations, we've done the work, we have these systems and processes in place, that might actually be something that consumers want. And
Right.
it's certainly if you're trying to sell business to business or you're trying to sell into government markets, you have to be secure, right? And companies have realized that actually it's not that they don't want to be secure, they just have to be told how to be secure. So within what boundaries and parameters do I have to put my resources
Hmm.
in order to be able to access particular markets? And you know, the private sector has worked very, very closely with governments all over the world. You know, in some places less, in some places more, of course. The United States, they tend to be rather more averse to regulation than, say, in Europe. But yeah, it's a very interesting story, and it's an area of research actually that hasn't had an awful lot of work done on it in the context of cybersecurity. So it's an interesting space to look if anyone's looking for projects.
Sure, sir. So let's talk about how cyber warfare happens, right? So what exactly is cyber warfare and how do militaries around the world execute that?
Yeah, good question. Cyber warfare, it's one of those terms that people working in the field don't like very much, but it's a term that's used. So we have to deal with it. It's a sort of language that governments use, that civil society uses, that the media uses, of course. For me, cyber warfare is military intelligence, statecraft conducted through cyber means. So I prefer to leave it as something that states and their partners do, rather than as something that we all do, or criminals do, or hackers do. They certainly do things that look a little bit like warfare, but I prefer to think of it as military intelligence statecraft. Now, what's included in that? Is espionage part of that? Is state-sponsored theft of intellectual property part of that? Possibly not. But I do think there's a question around, what warfare looks like in the 21st century, and whether cyber warfare is a primary means of conducting what, at the end of the Second World War, we might have called economic warfare or political warfare, which were certainly concepts that the US used. But I think we have to be quite careful, really, about calling anything war or warfare, because it brings connotations of militarization, of militaries being involved in things that in reality they're not, for the most part. There are instances of cyber warfare that definitely are cyber warfare. So, for example, countries in conflict already, like Russia and Ukraine, or between Gaza and Israel, definitely, there are instances we could 100% call cyber warfare, whether as standalone cyber operations or as things that are integrated in normal military operations or that facilitate military operations. Absolutely, yes, there are. There are also other instances, like, for example, the US, UK, and Australian operations against Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, that were, again, part of joint military operations against a non-state actor. So kind of a counter-terrorism mission, kind of a counterinsurgency mission, but definitely a kind of state military intelligence joint operation. And I would rather cyber warfare was restricted to those types of things. So we're either in conflict or something very much like it, because the wider you cast your net and call everything cyber warfare, the less useful that term becomes. And it has that militarized connotation that I think we should resist, because most of what's happening, in a bad sense, on the internet is crime. And while states do conduct crime, cybercrime, like North Korea, mostly it's conducted by criminal actors, unsurprisingly. And to call all of that cyber warfare is just really, really unhelpful. It certainly doesn't help policy. And it helps create a climate of media expectation or kind of concern that it's looking in the wrong place. Just call it crime, and we can deal with it as crime, right? It's a law enforcement issue. It's an international public policy issue, yes, but it's not war.
Exactly. That's the thing. Most of what the media calls is an issue of cybercrime. It's actually an issue of law and order, right?
Yes.
So, how can public-private information sharing and analysis centers can
Mm.
strengthen and improve cyber threat intelligence across sectors?
Yeah, I mean, it's the age-old question, actually, is this is an informational environment, and it's not tangible, it's not material in any normal way. It's information, it's data that's flowing through the networks. It's doing it really, really fast as well. And to be able to intervene or understand what's happening on the networks, we need to have data and information. And therefore, some people have it. Somebody has some more over there. This actor has it over here. How do we share that to create a proper picture of the threat environment that then allows us to make decisions in an informed and intelligent way? And I don't, there's nobody argues against that anymore. It's just, it is what we do. The question that you're asking, of course, is how we do it best. And one thing that's been really, really effective in this space in many different parts of the world is sector-specific information sharing and analysis centers. So the global finance sector, for example, has very effective information sharing systems and mechanisms that allow real-time sharing of cyber threat intelligence, that allows the engineers and administrators and the security operation centers and so on to see what's happening in real time on the networks in ways that threaten their sector specifically. It's not very useful to the finance sector necessarily to know what's happening in agriculture, right? Or logistics. They want to know what's happening in the finance sector, the threats, the actors, and the ways that they need to respond. They need to understand their own vulnerabilities and the dynamics of what's happening in that threat space. So information sharing in a much more focused way is definitely of great use. And of course, there's cross sector mechanisms too. So you have national level, what are called CERTs, computer emergency response teams, that will share information among themselves. If a European country is being attacked by a known act or by an actor, then they will share that information with their peers across Europe to make sure that everybody knows what's happening. So there's different kind of vertical sharing mechanisms and more horizontal ones, and new ones are being introduced all the time. But the people, it's all about how much energy and resource you put into it, because some of them emerge and then they fail because no one can be bothered, or they don't have the support. But some of them are very persistent and very, very useful.
Right. So do you think that something like a confidence building measure between the states can at least pacify the issue of cyber attacks amongst the nations, or is it just very unrealistic to think about?
It's like many things in this space. It's not the solution, but it can be part of a solution, right? So confidence building measures they tend to be bilateral, usually bilateral, but sometimes multilateral understandings between countries that create expectations about what is and what is not permitted, and expectations of assistance, perhaps. And they can be useful. But as with all those types of arrangements, they have to be done in good faith. And if they're not, then they're useless.
Okay. Two
Right?
nations are fighting. What is there I mean, the issue is at hand.
Yeah,
How you can sign a CVM in front of that?
exactly. So I think they have a place, absolutely. Yeah, and if they do some good, that's great. They need to be revised and looked at and reviewed, of course, to see if they're effective, whether they need to be changed. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, yes, a good thing.
Right. So now we are at the end of our interview, since we promised you 1 hour and we'll just take you 1 hour of your time. So, as an academician who has mentored so many students, what life advice will you give to our viewers who intend to pursue their dream careers, be it in the academia or outside of it in the high technology sector? Someone like me, I'm also trying to make it
Yeah.
high technology sector, the academia of it.
Yeah, it's a funny one. Academia for me is a second career. So I came back as a student when I was much older than 30.
Oh,
And I'm possibly not the best person to give advice about a first career, but I have dealt with many thousands of students. And the thing I would say is that it's a combination of what you're good at and what you enjoy, right? It's no more complicated than that. So if you find a field that really energizes you, that fascinates you, that you do the extra reading, and you go to the events and you talk to the people, that's a pretty good place to start. Beyond that, it's difficult, and life is difficult, and I think it's harder for students these days than it was for me when I was 21 or whatever. I do advise just going out there and listening to people and talking to people and getting different perspectives on the problems and the issues that interest you and that you enjoy. And when I came back as a student in my 30s, the thing that I got the most from was not the classes, not the readings that I did. It was going to and talking to people at events, conferences, workshops, random conversations with journalists or policymakers. And just that was my education, I think, was the major part of that. So anyone is in the position to be able to do that, fantastic. But if you're not, it's just, what are you good at? What do you enjoy? And I think it's the enjoyment factor, the fascination, the desire to learn is really what's going to pull people through. And the corollary to that is you don't always know where you're going to go from day one, right? Strange things happen. You follow some odd paths, some dead ends maybe, but experiment, keep an open mind, and you'll get there in the end.
right. So, thank you very much, sir, for doing this, and we hope to host you again for such an interview at GeoStrata. And thank you.
Thanks, Nisarg. It's been a pleasure.